Then eventually got to his wee body, and we took that out the bin and we put him on the floor, and then it's a case of recovering all the evidence that you can. So you're considering things like hairs, fibres, skin flakes, all this kind of trace evidence or biological evidence that could link him back to a place or to a person. When I was 12, I watched a TV programme, and it was about a farmer who had murdered his wife. He then attacked himself with a knife to make it look like it had been a robbery gone wrong. But you had forensic scientists going in, and they looked at the blood patterns, the way the blood was in the house. They looked at the injuries on his body, and they basically said, there's no way that this has been somebody that's come in and done this to him. He's done this himself. Look at the way the blood's distributed around the house. And basically, they just debunked his whole story. And I just sat and watched it and thought, oh my God, that's what I want to do. And that was it from that point. Went to university, did a biology degree, and then went on and did a master's degree in forensic science.
And what kind of things are they teaching you at uni?
You learn about blood pattern analysis, you learn about DNA profiling, all the different kinds of forensic science, and then eventually you focus on the part you want to do, which for me was biology. So I got to go and see autopsies, I got to see actual casework being done in the laboratory, which was a brilliant experience to be able to bring back and then put into my own job when I did eventually start my career.
So what is the difference, say, between forensic sciences and like crime scene investigation, or is that like the practical application of?
So the difference probably depends on where you work. In Scotland, we have a model which we call crime scene to court model. So as a forensic scientist, I attend crime scenes, I do the follow-up work in the laboratory, and then I go to court and explain the evidence to court. So I would attend serious crime, for example, unexplained deaths, murders, serious sexual crimes. So in my role, I span everything from crime scene right through to court. However, there was some people who concentrate on crime scene only and some people who are lab-based, and it really depends on what your role is and the crime type you're working on. In our organisation, we also do ballistics, which is the investigation of firearms. We do chemistry, which looks into fires, tool marks, footwear marks. There's also document and handwriting. There's forensic science behind controlled drugs, toxicology, drug driving, drink driving. So it's a massive, massive area. Forensic basically means for the court. So you're applying science to the court, and biology is my area of science, but there's lots of other areas of science that are equally as applicable, just a different kind of case study.
What was your first case?
I don't remember the case exactly, but I'll never forget the first thing I examined. So when you're at uni, you learn how to look for blood, you learn how to look for body fluids, and basically you've got clothing that somebody's dropped a bit of blood on, and it's nice clothing that's bought at a charity shop or donated by people at the uni. First case, I examined the clothing of a homeless man, picked up his trousers, and out the bottom of his trouser leg fell a jobby, as we would say in Scotland. So it's a very steep learning curve. As a forensic scientist, you start going to crime scenes, you look at clothing. It's a different world to what you grew up in, thankfully, and it's a very, very steep learning curve, but I will never forget that as the first item I examined as a real-life forensic scientist.
But you were doing blood splatter analysis too and stuff. Where was the blood, or what was the blood that was being splattered at university?
So at university, you do blood spatter analysis training. So you just put paper all around the room. We have horse blood, or sometimes you'll use pretend blood, and you basically just throw it about, do different things just to look how blood behaves, and that is your training. One particular case, woman had been found dead in the bathroom of her boyfriend's flat, and the boyfriend said she had fallen off the toilet and had some kind of fit, and that had caused the blood patterns. But the way the blood was radiating upwards, we believed was because she had been struck when she was lying on the ground, and that is why the blood would go upwards. If she'd been having a fit, the blood would have gone outwards. So we recreated this in the toilets at work with a turnip and a pool of blood, and although it's not ideal, it still gives you an idea of how the blood would behave.
Can you remember the first time you saw a body in the field?
The first time I saw a body was actually when I was a student doing my placement for my master's degree. I was in America, and the director of the lab thought it was important that I experienced that side of the job. And the first body I ever saw was a 3-month-old baby, a sudden infant death baby. I was 23. I was thousands of miles away from home, and that was the first dead body I ever saw, the first post-mortem I ever saw. And I just remember going home from that and sitting in the room where I was staying and waiting on the time difference being right so I could phone my mum, because I just wanted to speak to my family. And that's the first time I saw a dead body. At work, the first time I saw a dead body was again a post-mortem. Back in the day, when you started in the lab, they kind of wanted to test that you had what it took to deal with that kind of thing. So we got taken to the mortuary and you got stood beside the post-mortem table. So you went behind glass, you got all the sights and the smells, and you watched a post-mortem from beginning to end. And that was really, I think, their way of testing if you were able to cope with this and how you would deal with the pressure of seeing someone dead up close. It's not until you go home that you start to think, I've just seen a dead person, and that's when it hits home. And that's what I learned very early on in my career, is you can't let that voice take over. You can't focus too much on that side of things, or you would take too much of your job home with you.
What was the biggest case you worked on?
Probably the first case that got the most media attention was the murder of Angelika Kluk. And that was the murder of a Polish student in Glasgow. So Angelika's body was found underneath the church in the centre of Glasgow. She'd been missing for several days. My involvement was to look at her body, recover any forensic evidence from her body, and that was done underneath the floorboards beside her. So the Angelika Kluk crime scene was quite difficult in that she was found underneath the floorboards. Her body was directly underneath a trapdoor in the floor, and that trapdoor was bisected by a beam, a supporting beam for the floor. So the difficulty is that I wanted to examine her body where she lay. From looking at the crime scene pictures, it was apparent this was going to be a sexually motivated crime. The fly of her trousers was undone. There's quite a lot of blood on her hands. And as soon as you move a body that is bleeding or a body that has any other body fluids, then you're going to start redistributing that body fluid, and that potentially can destroy any forensic evidence. And it can also mean you might not be able to give opinions about how a body fluid was distributed, for example, semen inside the body. So I wanted to examine her where she lay. To do that, I needed to go down the trapdoor. Now, the trapdoor was tiny because it was bisected with this wooden beam. So first of all, we thought, well, we'll cut the wooden beam and make the trapdoor a little bit bigger. But by cutting the wooden beam, immediately you're going to contaminate the crime scene underneath. There's also the health and safety risk as well. You're cutting a big beam from a very, very old wooden floor. It could be potentially very dangerous. We talked about cutting an area of the floor further away and crawling along to where her body was, but again, health and safety-wise, we didn't want to do that. So in the end, the decision was made that I would just try and squeeze down this trapdoor and see if I could fit, and we'd take it from there. So that's what we did. So the first step is to recover any evidence round about the opening to the trapdoor, because Angelika's body has gone down there, but we don't know at that point if the murderer has gone down there as well. So we recovered all the evidence from the trapdoor, and then I wriggled down the space of the trapdoor underneath the floorboards so I could then recover any evidence from Angelika's body. I then did the follow-up work in the laboratory and then eventually presented that evidence in court. And it led to Peter Tobin being jailed, and he was then established to be a serial killer, and he was convicted of murdering 2 other young girls who had actually been missing for, I think at that point, nearly 20 years. So that became massive.
What's been the worst thing that you've seen in your work?
Wow. I've seen a lot of horrible stuff. I think that the obvious one would be the rape and murder of a young boy who had been raped and murdered by a convicted paedophile and put down a bin chute. So that investigation, the wee boy was in the bin, and we had to recover his body from the bin, which is a painstaking process. When you arrive at a crime scene, probably your natural instinct is to go straight to the body and start recovering the evidence. But in this case, he was in the bin and there's a lot of rubbish on top of his little body. So we had to recover everything methodically from the bin, because there could be anything in there that could be evidence, there could be weapons, there could be the accused clothing. So everything has to be recovered and recorded very methodically. Then eventually got to his wee body, and we took that out the bin and we put him on the floor of the bin shed he was in, and then it's a case of recovering all the evidence that you can. So you're recovering anything that is going to be a trace of evidence from whoever's killed him or wherever he was killed. So you're considering things like hairs, fibres, skin flakes, trace amounts of paint, DNA, body fluids, all this kind of trace evidence or biological evidence that could link him back to a place or to a person. So it's just a case of very methodically working in a team with the pathologist, with the photographers who are recording it, and with the police to recover everything methodically, so that if you go down to court further down the line, everything is recorded properly.
Does it have an emotional impact on you?
Yeah, I'd say every crime scene you go to has an emotional impact on you. I could probably close my eyes and imagine every crime scene I've been at. You can picture it, you can recall it very clearly. It has an emotional impact on you. It's being able to switch that off when you go home, and I guess being able to compartmentalise that to a certain extent so it doesn't take over your life, so you can actually learn to cope with it.
Is there any time you've ever been scared at work? Like, you're investigating a serial killer there. At one point, it's like, do you ever feel a fear?
Yeah, there's times in my work when I have felt scared. I mean, I felt scared going into this trapdoor. I mean, there's times I've gone home and I've lain awake and I've not been able to get to sleep for hours, and you're relaying it over and over in your head. But a lot of that time, what you're going through in your head is, have I done that right? Have I done everything I possibly can? Have I collected all the evidence I can? There's a lot of pressure on a scientist at a scene to get everything right first time, because you don't have a second shot at it. You've got to go and get everything. How I cope with it is I would go into work and speak about it with colleagues that had been to something similar, colleagues who could completely empathise and understand with what you've seen. And that's what we all do. We'll sit down with each other and we'll talk to each other. And my organisation is incredibly supportive. There's a lot of help and a lot of support. So if these things do start to get on top of you, if you feel you're not coping, then there's a massive amount of support. But for me, it's always been talking to a fellow colleague.
And obviously your job's portrayed a lot in media. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of TV shows that have. What are the most common mistakes that those shows make?
So, yeah, when they go in and they just shine a light and all the blood just glows and it's really easy to find. You know, the hours I have spent on a dark carpet with a torch looking for blood, whereas on the TV it's very easy, it just glows. I think the other thing is a forensic scientist works in a team. It's a massive team game. A forensic scientist doesn't speak to the suspects, doesn't carry out interviews, doesn't speak to the family. And I think the TV shows will portray this forensic scientist as someone who's carrying a gun and they're walking about and they're interviewing people and they're chasing people down the street. That doesn't happen. We have a small part to play as part of a much bigger team and a bigger investigation, and that is our part. Our part is to go in, gather the evidence, look at the evidence in the lab and take that evidence to court. That's it. When you interpret DNA profiles, there's a lot of desk work, a lot of thinking time. So you're not always out at crime scenes with dead bodies or in a laboratory messing about with chemicals and looking at dirty clothes and a knife, whatever. A lot of it is desk-based, thinking, interpreting, reporting, and I don't think that's ever portrayed.
DNA evidence started in like the 80s and 90s, and that was a big revolution in the kind of world of forensic investigations. Is there anything that could happen again like that, do you think, another step forward in the next 20 years? Yes,
so DNA was a massive thing in that it can give you a DNA profile from a tiny amount of material. You can search it on a database. It's a fantastic tool. The biggest thing that will change forensic science going forward, and we're not that far away from, is being able to say this DNA could have come from this person and this DNA has come from skin cells, or it's come from vaginal material, and actually tell you the source of the DNA. At the moment, you can do chemical tests, so you can say, right, that's a blood stain, that's a semen stain, you can obtain DNA from it. So you can give an opinion, the DNA is from this body fluid, but there's a lot of times you can't say what the DNA came from, how long it's been there, how it got there. So, for example, if you've got a sex offence case and you've got the victim's DNA in the person's hands, you couldn't say that was vaginal material, but a test that can tell you the source of the cell, then that would be massive in a lot of these types of cases. So being able to actually pinpoint the source of the DNA is a big thing. And it's also going to become faster. I think we'll get to a point where you can actually, at a crime scene, get blood and be able to get all the information from the blood at the crime scene instead of going away to a lab and waiting a couple of days. So the technology is becoming faster, more sensitive, and soon it's going to give us a lot more information as well. Also, there's a lot of DNA work being done to be able to actually say that this is their profile, but they would have had this colour eyes, their hair would have been that colour, this is what they would have looked like. All that work is all bubbling away under the surface, and we're constantly improving the DNA. And DNA has only been in regular use in forensic science for just over 20 years. And the amount that it has come on in those 20 odd years is incredible. So where we'll be in 20 years from now is really exciting.
These must be very hard things to go to. Why do you do the job? What's the satisfaction you get out of it?
I guess you can't undo what's happened, but you can stop that person doing that to someone else. And also, I guess, it gives people closure, whatever that word means. You can give the families an answer. And that's rewarding. That's very rewarding. The work that I was involved in Angelica's murder is fantastic because it led to further investigations that led to the discovery of the bodies of 2 young women, which gave their family answers. So being involved in that case was a massive thing in my career, and that's something that I look back on and I am proud of it. But I just think everything, every time you do a bit of work and you get a good result and somebody gets an answer, then, everything, I think I'm just really grateful that I do have this job and that I'm involved in this kind of work.
I've probably cleaned up close to 300 or 400 different scenes where people have disemboweled themselves, put a knife in their stomach and cut themselves open while they're alive. Even one gentleman decided to take some scissors and cut his intestines while he'd done it and throw them in the bath.